Chapter 11. Theories of Fixed and Circulating Capital. Ricardo. Ricardo introduces the distinction between fixed and circulating capital only in order to present the exceptions to the law of value, i.e., those cases in which the rate of wages affects prices. We shall only come to speak of these in Volume 3. The basic confusion is however evident from the start in the following juxtaposition. Quote, "This difference in the degree of durability of fixed capital, and this variety in the proportions in which these two sorts of capital may be combined." End quote. If we now ask what the two sorts of capital are, we are told, quote, "The proportions too in which capital that is to support labor and the capital that is invested in tools, machinery, and buildings may be variously combined." End quote. Fixed capital thus equals means of labor, and circulation capital equals capital laid out on labor. Capital that is to support labor is itself an absurd expression taken over from Adam Smith. Here, circulation capital is on the one hand lumped together with variable capital, i.e., with the part of the productive capital laid out on labor. On the other hand, however, because the opposition is not derived from the valorization process, constant and variable capital, but rather from the circulation process, the old Smithian confusion, two misconceptions arise. Firstly, the differences in the degree of durability of the fixed capital and the variations in the composition of capital in terms of constant and variable are taken as equivalent. The latter distinction, however, determines the variation in the production of surplus value. The former, on the other hand, insofar as the valorization process is concerned, is simply related to the manner in which a given value of means of production is transferred to the product. As far as the circulation process is concerned, it affects only the period of renewal of the capital laid out, in other words, the time for which this is advanced. If, instead of penetrating through to the inner mechanism of the capitalist production process, you adopt the standpoint of the phenomena in their finished form, these distinctions do in fact coincide. When the social surplus value is distributed between the capitals invested in different branches of industry, differences in the various times for which the capital is advanced, for example, varying lifespans in the case of the fixed capital, and different organic compositions of capital, thus also the different circulations of constant and variable capital, have similar effects in the equalization of the general rate of profit, and the transformation of values into prices of production. Secondly, from the standpoint of the circulation process, we have on the one hand the means of labor, fixed capital, on the other hand material of labor and wages, fluid capital. From the standpoint of the labor and valorization process, however, we have on the one hand means of production, means and material of labor, constant capital, on the other hand labor power, variable capital. As far as the organic composition of capital is concerned, see Volume 1, Chapter 25, Section 2, it is quite immaterial whether the same value of constant capital consists of more means of labor and less material of labor, or of more material of labor and less means of labor, whereas everything depends on the relation between capital laid out on means of production and that laid out on labor power. Conversely, from the standpoint of the circulation process, the distinction between fixed and circulating capital, it is just as immaterial in what proportion a given value of circulating capital is divided between material of labor and wages. From the one standpoint, the material of labor is ranked in the same category as the means of labor, as opposed to the capital value laid out on labor power. From the other standpoint, the part of capital laid out on labor power is ranked together with that laid out on material of labor, as opposed to the part of capital laid out on means of labor. In Ricardo, therefore, the part of capital value laid out on material of labor, raw materials and ancillaries, is not found on either side. It completely vanishes. It does not fit on the side of fixed capital, because it completely coincides in its mode of circulation with the part of the capital laid out on labor power. And it cannot be put on the side of circulating capital, because this would be a self-refutation of the equation taken over from Adam Smith and still silently running through Ricardo's writings between the antithesis, fixed and circulating capital, and the antithesis, constant and variable capital. Ricardo has far too great an instinct for logic not to be sensitive to this, and he therefore just lets this part of the capital disappear. It should be noted here that the capitalist advances the capital laid out on wages, to use the mode of speech peculiar to political economy, for different periods, according to whether he pays wages by the week, by the month, or every 3 months. In point of fact, the opposite happens. The worker advances the capitalist his labor for a week, a month, or 3 months, according to the intervals at which he is paid. If the capitalist did actually buy labor, instead of simply paying for it later, i.e., if he paid the worker his wages for the day, week, month, or 3 months in advance, then we could speak of an advance for these periods. But since he pays only after the labor has lasted for days, weeks, or months, instead of buying it and paying for it the time that it is to last, the whole thing is a capitalist quid pro quo, and the advance that the worker makes to the capitalist in the form of labor is transformed into an advance that the capitalist makes to the worker in money. This in no way alters the fact that the capitalist gets the product back from circulation, or realizes its value together with the surplus value incorporated into it, only after a shorter or longer period of time, according to the varying time that its production requires, or alternatively according to the varying time needed for its circulation. What the buyer of a commodity might want to do with it is completely immaterial to the seller. The capitalist does not get a machine any cheaper because he has to advance its entire value all at once, while the same value flows back to him from the circulation sphere only gradually and bit by bit, nor does he pay more for cotton because its value enters completely into the value of the product made from it, and is thus completely replaced at one stroke when this is sold in the market. Let us then return to Ricardo. 1. The characteristic feature of variable capital is that a definite, given, i.e. in this sense constant, part of capital, a given sum of value, assumed to be equal to the value of the labor power, although it is immaterial here whether the wage is the same as, or more or less than, the value of the labor power, is exchanged for a force that valorizes itself and creates value, labor power, which not only reproduces the value paid to it by the capitalist, but also produces a surplus value, a value that did not previously exist and is not bought for an equivalent. This characteristic property of the portion of value laid out on wages, which distinguishes it fundamentally from constant capital as variable capital, disappears as soon as this portion of capital laid out on wages is considered simply from the standpoint of the circulation process, and thus appears as circulation capital as against the fixed capital laid out on means of labor. This happens as soon as it is placed together under a single heading, that of circulating capital, with a component of the constant capital, that laid out on material of labor, and counterposed to another component of the constant capital laid out on means of labor. Here, surplus value, i.e. the very circumstance which transforms the sum of value laid out into capital, is completely ignored. It is similarly ignored that the portion of value that the capital laid out on wages adds to the product is freshly produced, and thus actually reproduced, while the portion of value that the raw material adds to the product is not freshly produced and not really reproduced, but is simply maintained and conserved in the value of the product, and hence merely reappears as a component of the product's value. As the distinction is presented from the standpoint of the antithesis between fluid and fixed capital, it simply consists in the fact that the value of the means of labor applied in the production of a commodity goes only partly into the value of the commodity, and hence is only partly replaced by the sale of the commodity, i.e. only bit by bit and gradually. On the other hand, the value of the labor power and objects of labor, raw materials, etc., applied in the production of a commodity goes into the commodity completely, and is therefore completely replaced by its sale. In this respect, one part of the capital presents itself as fixed in regard to the circulation process, and the other as fluid or circulating. What is involved in both cases is the transfer of given, previously advanced values to the product, and their replacement when the product is sold. The sole distinction here is whether the transfer of value, and therefore the replacement of value, proceeds bit by bit and gradually, or all at once. The all-important distinction between variable and constant capital is thereby obliterated, and with it the whole secret of surplus value formation and of capitalist production, namely the circumstances that transform certain values and the things in which they are represented into capital. The components of capital are distinguished from one another simply by the mode of circulation, and the circulation of commodities has of course only to do with already existing given values. The capital laid out on wages has a particular mode of circulation in common with the portion of capital laid out on raw materials, semi-finished goods, and ancillaries, in contrast to that laid out on means of labor. We can thus understand why bourgeois political economy held instinctively to Adam Smith's confusion of the categories fixed and circulating capital with the categories constant and variable capital, and uncritically echoed it from one generation down to the next for a whole century. It no longer distinguished at all between the portion of capital laid out on wages and the portion of capital laid out on raw material, and only formally distinguished the former from constant capital in terms of whether it was circulated bit by bit or all at once through the product. The basis for understanding the real movement of capitalist production, and thus of capitalist exploitation, was thus submerged at one blow. All that was involved on this view was the reappearance of values advanced. Ricardo's uncritical reception of Smith's confusion is more surprising not only than that of the later apologists, among whom the confusion of concepts is rather something unsurprising, but also than that of Adam Smith himself, since Ricardo, in contrast to Smith, presented value and surplus value consistently and clearly, and in point of fact, upheld the esoteric Adam Smith against the exoteric. Among the physiocrats, there is none of this confusion. The distinction between annual advances and original advances is related solely to the different reproduction periods of the different components of capital, agricultural capital in particular, while their views on the production of surplus value constitute a part of their theory which is independent of these distinctions, a part in fact that they held up as its culminating point. The formation of surplus value is not explained in terms of capital as such, but ascribed simply to one specific sphere of capitalist production, agriculture. 2. The essential feature of the definition of variable capital, and hence of the transformation of any sum of values at all into capital, is that the capitalist exchanges a definite, given, and in this sense constant, value for value-creating power, a magnitude of value for the production of value, for self-valorization. Whether the capitalist pays the worker in money or in means of subsistence does not affect this fundamental characteristic. It affects only the mode of existence of the value advanced by him, which exists in one case in the form of money, with which the worker himself buys his means of subsistence on the market, in the other case in the form of means of subsistence that he consumes directly. Developed capitalist production in fact assumes that the worker is paid in money, just as it assumes in general that the production process is mediated by the circulation process, i.e., a money economy. But the creation of surplus value, and hence the capitalization of the sum of value advanced, arises neither from the money form nor from the natural form of wages, i.e., of the capital laid out on the acquisition of labor power. It arises from the exchange of value for value-creating power, from the conversion of a constant quantity into a variable one. The more or less fixed character of the means of labor is a function of their degree of durability, i.e., of a physical property. According to their durability, they are worn out more quickly or more slowly, conditions remaining otherwise the same, and thus function for a longer or shorter time than fixed capital. But it is in no way simply this physical property of durability which leads them to function as fixed capital. In metalworks, the raw material is just as durable as the machines with which it is processed, and more durable in fact than many components of these machines, leather, wood, etc. But the metal serving as raw material does not form any the less a part of the circulating capital, while the functioning means of labor that may be constructed of the same metal form part of the fixed capital. Thus it is not its material, physical nature, its greater or lesser propensity to perish, which makes the same metal in one case fixed capital and in the other case circulating capital. This distinction rather arises from the role that it plays in the production process, in one case as object of labor, in the other case as means of labor. The function of a means of labor in the production process generally requires it to serve over and over again in repeated labor processes for a longer or shorter period of time. Its function thus prescribes a greater or lesser degree of durability for its material, but the durability of the material from which it is made does not make it in and for itself fixed capital. The same material becomes circulating capital if it is used as raw material, and for those economists who confuse the distinction between commodity capital and productive capital with the distinction between circulating and fixed capital, the same material or the same machine is circulating capital as a product and fixed capital as a means of labor. Even though it is not the durable material of which the means of labor is made that makes it fixed capital, its role as means of labor does require it to consist of a more or less durable material. The durability of its material is thus a condition for its function as means of labor, hence also a material basis of the mode of circulation that makes it fixed capital. Other things being equal, the greater or lesser perishability of its material imprints it to a lower or higher degree with the stamp of fixedness, and is thus very fundamentally bound up with its quality as fixed capital. If the portion of capital laid out on labor power is considered exclusively from the standpoint of circulating capital, i.e. in contrast to fixed capital, and if the distinction between constant and variable capital is therefore lumped together with the distinction between fixed and circulating capital, it is then natural, as the material reality of the means of labor is an essential basis for its character as fixed capital, also to derive the opposite character of the capital laid out on labor power as circulating capital from the material reality of this capital, and then to define circulating capital in terms of the material reality of variable capital. The real material of the capital laid out on wages is labor itself, self-acting, value-creating labor power, living labor, which the capitalist has exchanged for dead, objectified labor and incorporated into his capital, this being the way that the value existing in his hands is first transformed into a self-valorizing value. But the capitalist does not sell this power of self-valorization. It forms throughout simply a component of his productive capital, just like his means of labor, and is never a component of his commodity capital, like the finished product that he sells, for instance. Within the production process, the means of labor, as components of productive capital, are not distinguished from labor power as fixed capital any more than the material of labor and ancillaries coincide with it as circulating capital. From the standpoint of the labor process, both of these confront labor power as the personal factor, they themselves being the objective factors. From the standpoint of the valorization process, both are distinct from labor power, variable capital, as constant capital. Alternatively, if we are to speak of a material difference that affects the circulation process, this is simply that it follows from the nature of value, which is nothing other than objectified labor, and from the nature of self-acting labor power, which is nothing other than self-objectifying labor, that labor power constantly creates value and surplus value as long as it continues to function, that what presents itself on its side as movement, as the creation of value, presents itself on the side of its product in a motionless form as created value. If the labor power has performed its function, then the capital no longer consists of labor power on the one hand and means of production on the other. The capital value that was laid out on labor power is now value which has been added to the product, together with surplus value. In order to repeat the process, the product must be sold, and with the money released by this, labor power has constantly to be bought afresh and incorporated into the productive capital. This, then, is what gives the portion of capital laid out on labor power the character of circulating capital in contrast to the capital that remains fixed in the means of labor. But if the secondary characteristic of circulating capital, which labor power has in common with a part of the constant capital, raw materials and ancillaries, is made into the fundamental one, i.e., the fact that the value laid out on it is transferred in its entirety to the product in whose production it is consumed, and not gradually and bit by bit, as in the case of fixed capital, that it must therefore also be replaced in its entirety by the sale of the product, then the portion of capital laid out on wages must also consist materially not of self-acting labor power, but of the material elements that the worker buys with his wages, i.e., of the part of the social commodity capital that enters the worker's consumption, the means of subsistence, in other words. The fixed capital then consists of the means of labor, which perish more slowly and need only be replaced more slowly, while the capital laid out on labor power consists of the means of subsistence, which have to be replaced more rapidly. The boundary between quicker and slower perishability, however, tends to get blurred. Quote, "The food and clothing consumed by the laborer, the buildings in which he works, the implements with which his labor is assisted, are all of a perishable nature. There is, however, a vast difference in the time for which these different capitals will endure. A steam engine will last longer than a ship than the clothing of the laborer, and the clothing of the laborer longer than the food which he consumes." End quote. Ricardo forgets here the house in which the worker lives, his furniture, his tools of consumption such as knives, forks, dishes, etc., all of which possess the same character of durability as do the means of labor. The same things and the same classes of things thus appear now as means of consumption, now as means of labor. The distinction, as expressed by Ricardo, is this, quote, "According as capital is rapidly perishable and requires to be frequently reproduced, or is of slow consumption, it is classed under the heads of circulating or of fixed capital." End quote. He notes below this, quote, "A division is not essential and in which the line of demarcation cannot be accurately drawn." End quote. Thus we have happily ended up once again back with the physiocrats, where the distinction between annual advances and original advances was a distinction in times of consumption, and hence also in the varying reproduction times of the capital applied. It is simply that what in their case expressed a phenomenon of importance for social production and is depicted in Quesnay's Tableau économique in connection with the circulation process here becomes a subjective distinction, and one that Ricardo himself says is superfluous. As soon as the part of capital laid out on labor is distinguished from that laid out on means of labor, only by its reproduction period and thus its term of circulation, as soon as the one part consists of means of subsistence, the other of means of labor, so that the former is distinguished from the latter only by its more transient character, then every pertinent difference between the capital laid out on labor power and that laid out on means of production is obviously destroyed. This completely contradicts Ricardo's doctrine of value, as well as his theory of profit, which is in point of fact a theory of surplus value. He only ever considers the distinction between fixed and circulating capital insofar as different proportions of the two, in the case of capitals of equal size in different branches of industry, influence the laws of value, and particularly the degree to which a rise or fall in wages affects prices as a result of these circumstances. Yet even within this restricted investigation, he commits very great errors as a result of confusing fixed and circulating with constant and variable capital, and in fact he starts his investigation on a completely false basis. Thus, 1. Insofar as the portion of capital value laid out on labor power is subsumed under the heading of circulating capital, the characteristics of circulating capital are themselves falsely represented, and so in particular are the circumstances which subsume the portion of capital laid out on labor under this heading. 2. There is a confusion between the quality that makes the part of capital laid out on labor variable and the quality that makes it circulating in contrast to fixed. It is clear from the start that the definition of capital laid out on labor power as circulating or fluid is a secondary one, which glosses over its specific difference in the production process. Firstly, in this definition, the capitals laid out on labor and on raw materials, etc., are equivalent, and a classification that identifies one part of the constant capital with the variable capital does not come to grips with the specific difference of variable capital as opposed to constant. Secondly, although the portions of capital laid out on labor and on means of labor are counterposed to one another, this is in no way with respect to the fact that they are involved in the production of value in completely different ways, but simply with respect to the different periods of time during which the given value of both is transferred to the product. What is at issue in all these cases is how a given value which is invested in the production process of a commodity, whether as wages, the price of raw materials, or the price of means of labor, is transferred to the product, hence circulated by the product and brought back to its starting point if replaced by its sale. The only distinction here consists in the how, in the particular way in which this value is transferred and thus circulates. Whether the price of labor power, which in any case is previously determined by contract, is paid in money or in means of subsistence, in no way changes its character of being a definite and given price. However, in the case of wages paid in money, it is obvious that it is not the money itself that enters the production process, in the same way that it is not just the value but also the material of the means of production that enters this process. But if the means of subsistence that the worker buys with his wage are directly placed under one heading together with the raw materials, etc., as the material shape of circulating capital, then the means of labor counterposed to them, then this gives the matter a different appearance. If the value of one lot of things, the means of production, is transferred to the product in the labor process, then the value of the other lot of things, the means of subsistence, reappears in the labor power that consumes them and is similarly transferred to the product by the labor power's activity. What is involved in all these cases is similarly the mere reappearance in the product of the values advanced during production. The Physiocrats took this seriously and denied that industrial labor created surplus value. Thus, in the passage from Wayland already quoted, quote, "It matters not in what form capital reappears. The various kinds of food, clothing, and shelter necessary for the existence and comfort of the human being are also changed. They are consumed from time to time and their value reappears." End quote from Elements of Political Economy. The capital values advanced to production, in the shape of means of production and means of subsistence, here both equally reappear in the value of the product. The capitalist production process is thus successfully transformed into a complete mystery, and the origin of the surplus value present in the product completely withdrawn from view. What is also brought to fulfillment here is the fetishism peculiar to bourgeois economics, which transforms the social, economic character that things are stamped with in the process of social production into a natural character arising from the material nature of these things. Means of labor, for instance, are fixed capital, a scholastic definition which leads to contradictions and confusion. Just as we have shown how, in the labor process, see Volume 1, Chapter 7, it depends entirely on the role which the objective components play at the time in a particular labor process on their function, whether they function as means of labor, material of labor, or product, so, in precisely the same way, means of labor are fixed capital only where the production process is in fact a capitalist production process and the means of production are thus actually capital, i.e. possess the economic determination, the social character, of capital. Secondly, they are fixed capital only if they transfer their value to the product in a particular way. If this is not the case, then they remain means of labor without being fixed capital. In the same way, ancillaries such as fertilizer, if they give up their value in the same particular way as do the greater part of the means of labor, are fixed capital, although they are not means of labor. What is at issue here is not a set of definitions under which things are to be subsumed. It is rather definite functions that are expressed in specific categories. If it is the destiny of the means of subsistence in themselves, a property devolving on them in all circumstances, to be capital laid out on wages, then it also becomes the character of this circulating capital to support labor. If the means of subsistence were not capital, then they would not support labor power, although it is in fact precisely their character as capital that gives them the property of supporting capital by the labor of others. If means of subsistence are inherently circulating capital, after this has been transformed into wages, then it further results that the size of the wage depends on the ratio between the number of workers and the given mass of circulating capital, a favorite proposition of the economists, whereas in point of fact, the quantity of means of subsistence that the worker withdraws from the market and the quantity which the capitalist has at his disposal for his own consumption depend rather on the ratio between surplus value and the price of labor. Ricardo, like Barton, constantly confuses the ratio between variable and constant capital with the ratio between circulating and fixed capital. We shall see later on how this vitiates his investigation of the rate of profit. Ricardo further equates the distinctions that arise in the turnover, for reasons other than the distinction between fixed and circulating capital, with the latter distinction itself. Quote, "It is also to be observed that the circulating capital may circulate, or be returned to its employer, in very unequal times. The wheat bought by a farmer to sow is comparatively a fixed capital to the wheat purchased by a baker to make into loaves. One leaves it into the ground and can obtain no return for a year. The other can get it ground into flour, sell it as bread to his customers, and have his capital free to renew the same, or commence any other employment in a week." End quote. It is characteristic here that wheat, although as seed corn it serves not as means of subsistence but as raw material, is firstly circulating capital, because it is inherently means of subsistence, and secondly fixed capital, because its return stretches over a year. But it is not just the slower or more rapid return that makes a means of production into fixed capital, but rather the specific manner in which it gives up values of the product. The confusion created by Adam Smith has led to the following results. 1. The distinction between fixed and fluid capital is confused with the distinction between productive capital and commodity capital. Thus, the same machine is circulating capital, for example, when it exists on the market as a commodity, and fixed capital when it is incorporated into the production process. It is impossible to see here why one particular kind of capital should be more fixed or more circulating than another. 2. All circulating capital is identified with capital laid out or to be laid out on wages. This is the case with John Stuart Mill, among others. 3. The distinction between variable and constant capital, which Barton, Ricardo, and others already confuse with that between circulating and fixed capital, is eventually reduced completely to the latter distinction, as with Ramsay, for example, who takes not only means of labor, but all means of production, raw materials, etc., as fixed capital, and only the capital laid out on wages as circulating capital. But because the reduction is accomplished in this way, the real distinction between constant and variable capital is not grasped. 4. The most recent English economists, and even more so the Scottish ones, who view everything from the unutterably narrow standpoint of a bank clerk, such as MacLeod, Patterson, and others, transform the distinction between fixed and circulating capital into that between money at call and money not at call, that is to say, between deposit money that can be withdrawn without prior notification and money whose withdrawal requires such notification.